Thank you very much indeed for the invitation to speak today. I'd like to pay my respects initially to oppressed people everywhere and to future generations. I'd like to also recognise that this builds on the work of Harry Burns last year and Michael Marmot's talk there, but even more powerfully, in my view, the talk earlier this morning from Elizabeth Elliot, which was one of the best I've heard in years. I don't know if Elizabeth's still here, but you might be amused, on the way as I walked here this morning, I passed a tram stop where there was an advert attracting your attention by saying, "Give your pet the best night's sleep ever." And this was advertising air beds for pets. We're in that sort of society where we can tolerate that. I'm going to talk about the social determinants of health, particularly to emphasize what I believe is the true meaning of social, not the way it's become corrupted. Briefly talk about health inequalities and emphasize the gradient. The reason I want to talk particularly about the gradient is that Michael in his talk there particularly talked about the very underprivileged and the very privileged, but the point is that it's a gradient, it's not a binary division. And then briefly touch on, in very broad terms, what we can do. Now, most of us who trained in medicine will be very familiar with what I call the traditional determinants of health. This is what I was taught about at medical school. I'm sure it's still what we spend a lot of time talking about with medical students these days. What we've been hearing about from Sir Harry and Sir Michael and Elizabeth are the social determinants of health. These issues that, as Michael said, taken from the WHO, are the conditions in which people are born, grow up, educated, live, die, grow old, and all the rest of it work. I'm not going to go through them, but fundamentally there are a range of issues that influence our lives. And I'll say a little bit about what Michael talked about, power as well. What unites these social determinants of health, apart from why they're called social, is that if you have them, you don't just have one. You know, James Packer isn't rich and lives in a crappy house. If you're poor, you have the negative aspects of all these: poor income, poor housing, poor education, poor everything. If you're well off, it's at the other extreme. And if you're well off, you get good health. It's not just if you're badly off, you get bad health. And so these things, they hunt in packs. We usually discriminate against people at the lower end of whatever spectrum we're looking at here. And in total, they limit life's opportunities. And that's a very important factor. Harry Burns last year talked about the intergenerational cycle of adversity and the cycle of alienation that this creates. I think there's a common perception these days that the social just means what's out there. It's not genetic, it's not physiological, it's not just some accident, it's just out there in the milieu. But that's not what social means. What social means in terms of the social determinants of health is that we, over the last 12 or 14,000 years, since we started accumulating in societies rather than just family groups, have set the rules, the conditions in which we create differences in income, in housing, in discrimination of all sorts. These arise from the decisions we make in society, in our own homes, in our local communities, in Australia, in state government, in national government, in global institutions, but also the way we set up things like insurance companies and superannuation and all sorts of things. We make these decisions. They're not just natural, and if you believe in God, they're not even determined by God. And so I think in some ways it's better to think of them as societally created influences on health than social determinants of health. And I'd really like that to be one of the things that you perhaps remember. Michael talked about the very poorest and the very richest in society. What we see here is Australian society divided into 5 income groups, from the lowest to the highest, and life expectancy at birth. What you see is that it isn't just that the very poorest have a life expectancy 3 years less than the very richest, it's that there's a gradient all the way in between. This is an issue about the whole of society, not simply the people who are downtrodden the most. And just to illustrate it with hospitalizations after a heart attack, then what we see is that in New South Wales, it was 550 per 100,000 in the poorest group and something like 280 in the richest, but again, a gradient. Now, I haven't got time to show you more details of that. I have to ask you to take it on trust that what we see generally is that health improves as you move from being underprivileged to privileged in terms of population health, looking at averages. This is the general pattern. A priori, one might think it's only the very poorest who have crappy health, and once you get over a threshold, everyone else is fine. And that's the way lots of people want you to think about it. But the fact is, the evidence doesn't support that. The evidence supports this. A little bit wealthier makes you a little bit healthier. And Harry Burns again said it's not just about inequality in health, it's about inequality in society. And that's what's really important. So what can we do? Well, I believe at a societal level, we need to look at this gradient because it's crucial. What we've done over the last 150 years is we've raised everyone's level of health to some extent. But the fact is, we've still got very poor people, we've still got very wealthy people, and you could change this and put education in, or housing, or discrimination of any sort. And you've still got groups in between, and the groups in between is a little bit healthier all the way. There's this rising tide raising all boats. What we like to do in modern welfare states is not bother about the fact that people are poor. Well, it's just bad luck they're poor, but we feel a bit bad about them having to suffer poor housing or have poor access to health services, so we'll improve their health access a little bit. We sort of just give them a safety net at the bottom, but we don't fundamentally change their basic social status. And we've changed that a little bit in recent years by saying, well, we'll try and lift everyone, but we'll lift the bottom a bit more. But there's still the poor people. We're still not eradicating poverty and disadvantage and discrimination. That's still there. What I'm suggesting is if we're serious about reducing inequalities in health, we have to reduce inequalities in society. We have to eliminate this poor end, and that may mean eliminating the rich end. This is very popular in Double Bay and Toorak. But the advantage might be that everyone's health improves and we level out health, that there's fewer inequalities. And I believe that's what we need to be thinking about. So what's the relevance of this to the RACP? Well, I go back to Harry's questions. What do we see as our job? To manage illness and injury or to promote health? But equally, what does society expect us to do? Not just what do we think here. Now, what we've done, as I just emphasized with the the rising of the very poorest in society, the safety net approach, is we care for the most oppressed and most vulnerable. We look after prostitutes and drug addicts and the very poorest in society, and we put a health centre in a poor area, and we say we're tackling the social determinants of health. No, we're not. We're just providing some very essential services to people who have suffered the most from the social determinants of health in society. What we need to do is move from the safety net approach to a fairness approach. What we need to do is to more fairly distribute the social determinants of health in order to more fairly distribute health status. And we need to monitor and report on that, because if we just do things and we don't keep an eye on it, how do we know what happens? And as others have said, we need to make a fuss. And some of us love making a fuss. So what can you do? I'm not going to give you a recipe book, but if you really care about this, the most important thing here is to say, how can I make my practice? How can I make my service? How can I make my hospital more equitable? Not just responding to who comes and knocks on the door, but how do we make sure we're providing services to the people out there who need it? And I'll just illustrate this by the UK's Chief Medical Officer put together these 10 tips for health 20 years ago. They're all obvious, you know them. But a renegade group put together a social determinants alternative. And this is what we need to do if we want to promote health. We need to be tackling these sorts of things. So, remember the gradient. It's not just about the very poorest, and it's not just about health. We have to be tackling the inequalities in society. We have to tackle the social institutions that create that. And we need to be politicized. But what I want to say is, if we don't tackle climate change, that's all going to be a waste of time anyway.